Greetings, you curious, you courageous Herle Burlyites. We're going to get right to it today, a deep dive into Ontario politics in Queen's Park, the stories and the players. With me to do that, two journalists who know the scene better than most, Steve Paikin and Jessica Smith-Cross. Making his third appearance here, Steve is more than a figurative friend of the Herle Burly podcast. He's an actual friend of Herle, the shaggy-haired, deeply flawed host. Journalist, author, documentary producer, president of the Toronto chapter of the Hamilton Tiger Cat fan club, and venerable, I tell you, anchor of TVO's flagship current affairs program, The Agenda. Jessica is making her second appearance today, and with that, has attained official friend of the Herle Burly status. She's helped launch the excellent TheTrillium.ca and serves as its editor-in-chief. Prior to The Trillium, she was editor-in-chief of iPolitics and Queen's Park Briefing. Hey, thanks to both of you for joining us today on much shorter notice than usual. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, David. Hi, Jesse.
Love being here. Always good to see you, Steve.
Great. So, we're supposed to be 2 years away from an election in Ontario, but it doesn't feel that way, does it, Jessica?
No, certainly not. It definitely feels like the election is on already. Whether it is or not, whether we're a year away or actually two, I don't know. But it feels like everyone's talking like it's happening now.
Right. Steve, what's your take on this timing issue? I mean, the PCs floated this trial balloon of an early election, and it seemed to get met with a shrug. Are you one of these people that thinks back to Peterson in 1990 when you hear this idea?
Not really. I think that's the conventional wisdom, which is David Peterson went after only 3 years back in 1990 when he could have had 4 years. And as a result, because of that, the electorate punished him for not having a good reason for going early. I've always thought that the circumstances around that early election call were unique to that time. You'll well remember Jean Chrétien went after 3 years. He was not punished. He got another majority government. The former Premier of British Columbia went after 3 years, despite having an agreement with his Green Party colleagues not to, and he was not punished. He went in the middle of Oval, and he got another majority government. So each set of circumstances is different. I well remember back in 2003 when Ernie Eves won the leadership of or I guess in 2002 he won the leadership of the Ontario PC Party, and then waited a year and a half before having an election, which he lost to Dalton McGuinty. And if you ask him about it, he says the biggest mistake I made was not calling a snap election and going right away. So these things are all unique.
Right. And there were so many complicating circumstances for Peterson that people don't think about in retrospect. The constitutional talks, the onset of the recession, all sorts of things that were also factors, not just the early call of the election. But Jessica, it does help when you call an early election. It does help to have a reason, a fig leaf, something that other than your own political fortunes to justify this. And arguably it hurt Trudeau in 2021 that he didn't have that when he called a relatively early election. What could the Conservatives concoct as a reason why they need a new mandate?
Well, I know they don't want it to be the RCMP is breathing down our neck, which is what the opposition will try to make it be about, I think, if they get the choice. They might try to make it about housing, booze. I don't know. It's hard to tell what's on their agenda these days. Whatever it is, it's going to be, we need to do this. We need a new mandate, and the opposition is going to say no and stand in our way. They could choose highways, but there's nothing that really about any of those big issues that they like to talk about that says it needs to be now. The only thing that has sort of a time limit that they love to talk about is the carbon tax. So they could say, it's complicated. They have to say we think maybe Poilievre's going to win federally, so we have to decide what Ontario's going to do. Bonnie Crombie, she'd bring in a carbon tax, and we say, hell no. I think that's probably the most likely thing they'll choose.
Makes sense, Steve?
I think the reality is, regardless of what explanation they give for going early, none of them will really stand up to facts. And the fact is, the only reason they would go early is because they think they can win a new majority government mandate. The one lesson you might take from David Peterson's time in 1990 is that if you don't have at least a plausible explanation for going early, you do run the risk that the public will say, this is only in your interest, and it's not in our interest at all to spend another $150 million to have an election a year or two before we need to. So that's one thing they need to be careful of. If they're awfully darn sure, though, as I hate to say David Peterson was back in 1990, that the opposition parties are going to be underfinanced, not have enough candidates, not have adequate time to put a platform together, are not well known enough by the electorate that they feel they don't really need a good reason, they can go anyway. Well, fill your boots. But, that's a risk.
So do you think the primary driver for this movement to an early election is wanting to have the election when Justin Trudeau is still the prime minister,
yes,
so that they can run against him? Or is it the internal things that Jessica kind of alluded to that maybe they're trying to outrun?
I mean, if I could jump in there, yeah, I think Trudeau might be the primary one. There's a lot. He's a candy enemy, and if he's Bonnie Crombie's best friend, that's their go-to line. That's what we hear from them all the time now. And public mood might.
I think that would surprise Trudeau, to be honest. But
fair. And they can pursue this line, even though every time Doug Ford speaks about the prime minister, stands up next to them at a big auto funding event, they do come off as buddy-buddy, and he likes to talk about how he can work in party lines. You just switch gears, and now he's Bonnie Crombie's best friend when it's convenient as well.
Yeah. All right, well, let's talk about Ford and why they're doing so well politically right now, which they unquestionably are. Incumbents are in trouble in most locations, and the Ford government should theoretically be having negative impact from housing costs, from inflation, from problems in healthcare, as all the other governments are. Approval of the government's actually only at 31% in the most recent Abacus poll, yet they have a commanding lead in voter intent support. The website 338 gives them a literal 99% chance of winning an election if it were held today. What explains that strength that they have?
I don't need to remind you that polls are a great indication of what people thought yesterday. They are not predictive. And even if an election were called today, we'd still have a 30 to 35-day campaign ahead of us. And as we all know, stuff can happen during campaigns. So let's not take anything to the bank just yet. Having said that, you got to hand it to Doug Ford. When Doug Ford became Premier of Ontario in 2018, he had been the PC party leader for all of 3 months. He was perhaps, and I'm not saying this to be a smart aleck, it's just an empirically provable fact, he was probably the least prepared person in 150 years to be Premier of Ontario. His background, his training for the job, what he brought to the job was certainly less than any of his predecessors.
And in year one, it looked like it.
Yes, it did. And he had probably the worst first year of anybody in my memory, for sure. But having said that, the guy's got a bit of a superpower. And his superpower is that he comes across as kind of a, aw shucks, I may not be the smartest guy in the room, but I connect with the average person in the province. And if I screw up, I fess up, I go out to the microphones, I apologize, and for some reason, people cut me slack on it in a way that they wouldn't for another politician. And if you can pull that off, that's impressive.
I think, David, people aren't blaming Doug Ford for inflation and their own personal financial tight budgets because they're blaming Trudeau, which goes back to our reason for calling the election in the first place. People see that as more plausible in the way they see the world, that it would be somebody like Justin Trudeau responsible for these bad economic things, and they would see the friendly conservative Premier of Ontario.
Why would they be judging the Ford government substantially differently than they judge the Trudeau government? Because on the big picture issues, they're pretty aligned.
I think as well as anybody that people have sort of preset ideas of what the political parties are good and bad at, right? The Conservatives are always seen as good economic managers, Liberals, and even more so the NDP, not so much. So when people think, who do I blame? They're going to blame the Liberals in power, and the federal Conservatives would definitely help them do that.
I think also, David, he's helped by the blessing of low expectations. I mean, I think the reality is Doug Ford's gotten away with some things that Kathleen Wynne could not get away with because people saw her as an experienced politician who had real grasp of the files that she was working on. And when those files went south, they directly blamed her because they thought she ought to be better than that. Doug Ford, as I suggested, came into office not really demonstrating any expertise on any particular file at all. He had a bunch of good slogans, and he had kind of a nice way of connecting with people. And so he gets judged differently. That's lucky if you're him. It's a real problem if you're one of the three opposition leaders down at Queen's Park.
Right. What about, and Jessica, I mean, you were on the show about this. You've done a lot of work on this. What about the Greenbelt controversy? I mean, there are damning ethics reports already. There are cabinet and staff resignations already. There are police investigations ongoing already. You know, in my personal experience, these things can be quite damaging.
But we're in the waiting period right now. Yeah, it does hurt, I'm sure. People, I think that's now baked into what they see this party as about, right? The whole notion that Doug Ford wanted to sell off parts of the Greenbelt to benefit his wealthy donor friends is pretty well set in the Ontario public's consciousness. It may change, it may deepen if there is ultimately somebody charged, but that can take a very long time to happen if it happens.
Steve, why do you think it doesn't have more traction?
I think it goes back to that superpower that I mentioned earlier. He was it's funny. He's flipped a couple of times on this, right? He got caught during his first election campaign back in 2018 on video saying, we're going to open up the Greenbelt and we're going to let it rip. And then he got caught saying that. So he had to retract that and take that back. And then here he was again, handing his then Municipal Affairs and Housing Minister, Steve Clark, essentially carte blanche to go do things. And he did. And the Premier got an earful on that. So he flipped again. How many flip-flops is this on the issue now? Is that 3 or 4? I'm losing track. But the reality is that mea culpa that he did before the microphones, saying, I just got this wrong. I'm apologizing. I'm going to put things back the way they were. I'm going to put it right. And the fact that developers who were standing to gain $8 billion in profits, some of them are now suing him for this latest reversal on the Greenbelt. I mean, if you're a member of the electorate, you're thinking, well, if these rich developers are suing Doug Ford, I guess he's okay after all. It's really quite amazing. It's quite breathtaking how he's been able to manage the whole thing.
So walk me through how this works with him, okay? Because it's quite charitable to call it a flip-flop. I mean, a flip-flop is more like when you announce a policy and it runs into a lot of public disapproval and you reverse it. This is more like getting caught at something and getting caught at it a couple of times. So it's pretty clear you want to do it, right? And if you weren't getting caught, you would do it. It seems to me people should be less likely to forgive that.
Conventional wisdom would suggest you are right. And conventional wisdom doesn't work with Doug Ford. I mentioned the fact that he had only been party leader for 3 months when he got the job. The rules are different for him. He didn't have any history in the Progressive Conservative Party to speak of, not a lot anyway. And yet there he was winning the leadership, despite the fact that he won fewer ridings and got fewer votes than his opponent. There seems to be a different rule book for him. And it doesn't really matter. I guess it doesn't matter sometimes what he does, because that's not the only thing he's changed his position on big time, right? You remember the license plates. You remember during COVID, he brought in the most tough restrictions. People mutinied, and then he backed down on that as well. I mean, the guy changes his mind on a lot of things, but for whatever reason, people cut him more slack.
Jessica, you got a take on that?
What
connection does he make? Does it feel like real contrition to people? Does it feel like he's responsive to the public mood and therefore they can count on him to always do fundamentally what people want? What is the magic of that?
When you listen to him talk, more than any other politician, he does seem like a real human being who's, really sorry that he did this when he shouldn't have, or whatever the apology is. He comes across more than any other politician I have ever seen as genuine and sincere because of the way that he speaks when he's at a microphone. He's very good at it. It may be as simple as when somebody sees a clip of him on TV, it sounds like they believe him.
Right.
And not only that, David, I think as well, there are very few political events he does where he doesn't at some point pull out his phone and say, here's my phone number, just give me a call. And, I answer my own phone. And, in this day and age, where it's almost impossible to get a real person on the other end of the phone, or where when you call Queen's Park or you send an email to Queen's Park, everything is just, you get a voicemail, you get a canned automatic response. It's really difficult to get a hold of anybody these days. You've got a premier certainly conveying the impression that he's accessible anytime you need him. And I guess that goes a long way.
Have either of you ever called that number?
I have received calls from that number, but I have not deigned to try it myself.
Yeah.
Didn't work.
He didn't answer?
I didn't know.
All right. I had a suspicion. Let's talk about the power of consistency, the unyielding power of consistency. The world turns. Canada will go at least 32 years without a Stanley Cup. Sorry, Edmonton. And continuous investments in new technology can march us forward toward better lives. That last one is the aim of our presenting sponsor TELUS's newly branded Global Ventures arm. It is Canada's most active corporate venture capital fund. Since inception, it's invested in over 150 companies poised for significant growth and market transformation across 10 countries, working on solving some of the world's biggest challenges in agriculture, health, digital customer experience, and the Internet of Things. In 2023 alone, TELUS Global Ventures put over $200 million into 30 new ventures. Enough with the numbers. Let me just inject some granularity into this, a smattering of the good businesses we're talking about. Talk Life, an innovative global online peer support community for people to talk about their mental health and then get the services they need. Waymap, this is an accessibility-first, super accurate navigation app that works outdoors, indoors, and here's the kicker, even deep underground. And Code Labs, a company at the forefront of the smart building landscape. So back to our theme, the power of consistency. These are the kinds of investments that TELUS wants to keep on keeping on with, as Jerry Jeff would say. But as I've said and said and said here again, regulatory conditions, like what the government is considering right now on a new wholesale regime, play a major part in what they can do. TELUS believes the best way forward is a tailored approach that recognizes regional differences, as well as the companies who consistently invest in their services and how they can make Canada and the world a better place to live. All right, so the PCs are, and this is a tactic that I love as a political practitioner, they are burying Bonnie Crombie in negative advertising, right? I only really watch live sports on television anymore, but by God, on live sports, it's
everywhere.
Does that indicate that they see her and the Liberals as a bigger potential threat? I mean, nothing's a threat right now, but do they see the Liberals and Crombie as a bigger potential threat than Stiles and the NDP? You're nodding, Jessica.
Yeah, I think they do. I think they really do. And I think it sort of helps them in two ways. By painting her as the biggest threat, especially if they think they can defeat her, they're sort of telling voters not to care about the NDP either. And the best thing they can sort of do is have that split again, where voters maybe try to decide that, okay, it must be Bonnie Crombie, but then there's a core NDP that won't leave. And to keep that split going is to their advantage.
Yeah, if I can bring the historical context into this again, I don't have to tell you, David, knowing who your enemy is very key in politics. And if we go back to 1990 and that early election called by David Peterson, his troops didn't know who the enemy they should have been fighting was, right? Their early commercials were against a party that, people had already counted out. And, here was Bob Rae coming out of left field, and they didn't, literally, and they didn't sort of figure that out. The Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario this time has quite clearly decided at a very early going that their prime opposition will not in fact be the official opposition, which is the NDP, has been for the last two elections, but in fact will be the Liberals. They are more concerned about Bonnie Crombie's potential to derail their plans to get a third consecutive mandate. And so all of the ads, and I'm like you, I watch too much sports, they're all over the Stanley Cup playoffs, they're all over Blue Jay games with these ads calling her, I'm not even going to repeat it, they should pay if they want to use those monikers against her. But we're hearing all these expressions all the time. And they haven't done a thing against the NDP. They are going right after Crombie, full court press, and it has to be because they consider her the greatest threat.
And everyone else is silent.
Why would they, though, consider her the greatest threat? I mean, to be honest, outside of Mississauga, I presume nobody knows who she is in Ontario. And in terms of the Liberal brand, people are fleeing the Liberal brand everywhere in Canada. So,
first of all, I'm not sure how true that is about her not being recognized outside of Mississauga.
okay.
I think we have to remember she was a member of Parliament for 3 years before she got into municipal politics. For a very new political party leader at Queen's Park, she has more than average name recognition. I think.
Yeah, but I'm not saying much.
Yeah, but that's still. I mean, Mart Stiles and the NDP's had the job much longer than Bonnie Crombie has, and her name recognition would be. I mean, you've seen numbers I haven't. I'm guessing it's half of what Crombie's name recognition is. So, and the fact is, Bonnie Crombie runs in a way similar to the way Doug Ford runs. She's a populist politician who's dynamite at retail politics in the same way the premier is, and she, comes across in a very, accessible, I'm just like you manner. I remember her acceptance speech at her leadership convention was really quite unlike any other acceptance speech I'd heard before. Focusing not so much on legislative achievements, but how her life started. Her backstory is very interesting. She's not a woman who grew up in wealth, despite the commercials the PC party would have you believe. This is a woman who lived in rooming houses for a while. Her parents' marriage broke up when she's at a very early age. There was a lot of struggle there. Now, she's obviously done well since then, but reintroducing herself to the electorate with that backstory, which conveys an impression that I'm a lot more like you than you think. Let's see what that does, because it's an appealing backstory.
Let's revert to the NDP, though, because in fairness to them, they're the official opposition. So let's give them a look here. They've been the official opposition 2 terms in a row, yet they seem really, really far from being the alternative, much less the threat to the PC government. They were, I can tell you personally, I know this to be true, that they were ahead of the Ford PCs with 2 weeks to go in the 2018 election. And they haven't had a sniff of them since then. What's the problem?
I remember covering that election and being on the bus when that was happening. They were ecstatic. They were thrilled. They were over the moon. It was interesting to watch. What's happened since? I think they only get in that position when the Liberals are so low, and that's how they get there. And that's just not the case now. People have started to forget the things they didn't like about Kathleen Wynne. Apologies, David, and they're sort of going back to the way that the status quo has been in Ontario for a long time.
I think we have to remember that, what have we had, 43 elections in Ontario political history?
Yep.
43 elections, every single one of them, save for 2, have been won by the Liberals or the Conservatives. The United Farmers won an election in 1919, and the NDP won an election in 1990. So the reality is, for most Ontarians, for the longest time, when it comes to choosing who's going to govern, there are basically 2 choices. And every now and then, I think it's maybe happened 4 times in my lifetime, every now and then the NDP gets into second place and they start, considering the possibilities that maybe now is our breakthrough moment and we get to be the alternative. But then water seems to find its level and things go back to normal. I know people think that we have
What's your theory about that, Steve? What is your theory about why do the NDP have that ceiling?
We have very static politics in the province of Ontario. Look next door at the province of Quebec. They've got new political parties being invented all the time and getting a chance to govern all the time. Ever since World War II in Ontario, we have only ever had Liberals, Tories, and New Democrats represented at Queen's Park, save and except for the last couple of elections where the Greens actually broke through and won first 1 seat and now they have 2 seats. Our electoral politics are incredibly static. And it may well be that the big tents that the PC party and the Liberal Party represent are adequate to the task for the vast majority of Ontario voters. And they just, so far, don't see much reason to go beyond that.
Jessica, what are the NDP about these days? What are they trying to sell Ontarians on?
Oh, wow. What are they about these days? One of the first things that comes to mind is sort of keeping their own coalition together. It's been stressed of late. The whole Sarah Jama affair, the party handled her.
Fuck, that's a de minimis objective. Jesus.
Wow, what are we, 15 minutes in before Herle dropped an F-bomb? That's pretty
Marit Stiles is charming. She has a pretty left of center, but center of the road in that left sort of appeal. Less populist, I'd say, than her predecessor, but it is they still seem to be in a position of figuring out who we are all about now in the post-Horvath days. That might sharpen up a bit when they have to do a platform going into the next election. But for now, it does still seem like it's identity finding for them.
Yeah, David, if I can add to that, the best thing that Doug Ford has going for him right now, besides his own personal superpower we talked about, is the fact that if you don't like Doug Ford, you've got 3 left-wing options to choose from, and they are all splitting the vote just perfectly. I think in the what was the popular vote in the last election campaign? Didn't the Liberals and the New Democrats come within a tenth of a point of each other? I mean, it was just a perfect vote split. And I know Bonnie Crombie, when she first won the leadership, said, I think my party's become too woke. I think it's moved too far to the left. I'd like to bring it closer back to the dynamic activist center, but I'm not sure that has happened yet. I know she's had one announcement about tax breaks for small business, but I think in the main, Ontarians still essentially see Liberals, New Democrats, and Greens as being essentially indistinguishable from one another, and Doug Ford's got to love that.
We did a poll that was trying to explore that feeling. We had Palace Data do a poll for us. We asked sort of, are you voting for this party because you like them the best, or are you voting because you don't like the other guys? And so for the PCs, it was 22%. I'm voting PC because I want to vote PC. There was another 14 who said, I'll probably vote PC because I don't really like the other guys. That puts some number on that feeling of who's really there because the opposition isn't working for them or is in disarray right now.
Okay, so we are about to pass through the leafy veil into summer. July is the best month, and it's 2 weeks away. So in the spirit of lazy summer reflection, beloved Herle Burlyites, we have a little quiz for you, courtesy of our sponsor, CN. Here we go. In the 20s, yes, 100 years ago, CN started up a coast-to-coast radio network. What sports show did it establish? And what did that radio network eventually become? If you said the world of lacrosse, well, you were wrong. If you said Hockey Night in Canada, though, you win a small, inexpensive doll. And if you guessed that the radio network eventually became the CBC, you get to sing Bob Cajun at your next block karaoke party. Yes, the CBC sprang from the forehead of CN. Next question. In 1937, nearly 100 years ago, CN founded an airline using $5 million in federal seed money. It bought 2 Lockheed Model 10 Electras and 1 Boeing Stearman biplane. Economy class was more comfortable back then, by the way. So, what was the airline's name and what was it eventually renamed? Take your time. If you didn't say TransCanada Airlines and eventually Air Canada, you've never paid for a pillow or shrunk into a middle seat. Yes, CN birthed Air Canada. Next question, moving forward a bit. On November 17th, 1995, the most successful initial public offering in the history of Canadian equity markets began. The Canadian government, and by extension Canadian taxpayers, received $2.2 billion. What was the name of the company stock offered that day? If you didn't surmise CNR, well, you're missing the theme of this spot. Said theme being, CN is foundational. It's been around a long, long time, and it helped build Canada. And we appreciate it. More fun facts next week. Same Herle time, same Herle channel. Didn't another heroic show once use that line? So I interviewed in the first Ford term, I interviewed Andrea Horvath on the Herle Burly, and in more laterally, I've interviewed Marit Stiles. So I'll get to her leadership in a second. But my feeling after both interviews was that the NDP had not settled on a core critique of what was wrong with the Ford government. That they would object to a policy here or a policy there, but in terms of a core narrative about why the government should change, I don't really feel like they have that.
Art Stiles is pretty clear on that now. If it's not getting out there, it's there. It's the whole insider friends thing. He's going to give the Greenbelt away to his donors and insider friends, and they apply that to just about any issue that comes up. The whole Staples thing, Ontario Place, whatever it is, that is their line, and it's pretty clear. I heard it from some union pals of the NDP last week. JP Hornick had a very campaign-style speech about rejecting Doug Ford's back-scratching big box Ontario. That message is pretty united now.
Right.
Yeah, but David, if we go back to, and you referenced this earlier, I guess it was the 2018 election campaign where the NDP was a couple of weeks away from potentially winning the thing. But I think to the extent that there was a magic moment for Kathleen Wynne in that debate, it was the moment where she looked at Andrea Horwath and said, sometimes a premier's got to make tough decisions on behalf of the entire population that may actually attack one of your core constituents. And I think in that case, it was a union that was on strike at York University. Correct. Andrea, will you have the guts to stare down part of your coalition in order to make a decision that benefits the greater good? And Andrea Horwath could not do that. She clearly kicked that answer around. And if if we circle back to the notion of why the NDP never really has that big breakthrough, save and except for 1990, extraordinary circumstances, it may well be that too many people in Ontario still see the NDP as beholden to the unions, even more so than the Liberal Party is beholden to the unions, because they are and have been too. Whereas the Ontario PC Party, for better or for worse, is still seen as a party that represents a broader swath of Ontario. And while their special interest may be the people who develop the Greenbelt, again, the Premier's done his mea culpa on that, there is a sense that he still represents more of the general public than either of the other two major parties.
Okay, let's talk about Marit Stiles, because I'm going to echo what Jessica was saying, which is when she was on the Herle Burly, I thought to myself, holy Christ, this woman has game. She's smart. She's charismatic. She's articulate. I liked her. And now, being the leader of the opposition in Ontario is a pretty shitty job, Steve. You would know that. But Jessica, why do you think she's not breaking into the public consciousness more?
How much attention is the public paying right now? I mean, we're between elections, so that's part of it. They might come to know her better when they pay attention during an election cycle. But right now, if you're reading the news, you might get a quote of her. That's fine, but you can't really get a sense of her through a quote in a print story. Right. She's not featured on broadcast that much. They're trying through social media, but there's not a huge offensive there, nothing going viral there. Just how, if you're not nerds about it like we are, would you know yet who she is and what she's doing?
So you're saying you can't judge her until week 2 of the writ period is what you're saying?
Yeah, basically.
Right.
Having said that, while the opposition leader may be a lousy job, it's also a kind of a trial run for Premier. And I note that Premier David Peterson was opposition leader, Premier Bob Rae was opposition leader, Premier Mike Harris was a opposition leader, Premier Dalton McGuinty was the opposition leader. People get to kick the tires on you when you're the opposition leader and see if you've got the goods. And there's 4 names right there in the last, 35 years or so, 40 years almost now, where people have seen the opposition leader and thought, yeah, okay, I like that. I'm with you, David, in terms of Marit Stiles. I think she comes across in a very appealing way. She's a good speaker. She's got a sense of humor. She comes across well with average people. This goes back to, she may be, in terms of Ontario political history and what the public is prepared to entertain, she may simply be leading the wrong party for that. I know New Democrats won't like me saying that, but I just say, look at the record.
Yeah. What do you think, when you see her, Jessica, what do you think might break through ultimately about her?
She's more natural than Bonnie Crombie so far. And maybe that's spending time in the House, spending time as opposition leader. Though Bonnie Crombie has spent time in politics in Mississauga, she comes across like she has a sense of humor, like she's normal, like there's a person beyond the thing you see on TV.
Right. Right. All right. So let's talk about the Liberals for a second. They've edged ahead of the NDP in votes, and according to the polls, but they're far from the Conservatives. No honeymoon for their new leader. But again, Steve, that isn't unusual, again, because so few people, as Jessica was saying, have share of mind for who the leaders of the opposition are in Ontario.
That's true. And I think one of the things we learned from a by-election that took place in Milton, well, what was that, 4 or 5 weeks ago, is that as long as remember, this is a provincial by-election, but
Right.
every Liberal source I talked to about that by-election said the only thing we heard at the door was Justin Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, Justin Trudeau. So as long as Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister of the country, I don't see the path forward, and obviously stuff happens, but I don't see the path forward for Bonnie Crombie to be the Premier of Ontario in the next election. And I think if you were to feed truth serum to her team, they would say the same thing. They would benefit from a change in Ottawa more than anybody. And it's funny, I well remember in 1984, David Peterson just languishing in the polls as opposition leader, and him eventually saying, that albatross, Pierre Trudeau, around my neck is just preventing me from rising in the polls. And now I'm sure Bonnie Crombie's thinking the same thing about Pierre Trudeau's son, who is the albatross around her neck right now.
Yeah, you can see that when she decided to come out against a carbon tax. I think that was a big play from them. It wasn't easy to do, and that was one of the reasons that they did it.
Right. So, Jessica, if Trudeau were to take a walk in the smoke this summer, might that change the Ford government's thinking about an early election?
Oh man, maybe. There are still other reasons that they might want to do that. That their opposition parties would still be less prepared. The Greenbelt stuff might be they would have more time to avoid something happening with the police investigation. But it would take some wind out of their sails, I think.
I think if we look at the history of this kind of thing, I mean, we all know here that Ontarians have a multi-generational habit of putting one party in power on Parliament Hill and a different party in power at Queen's Park. It's just, and I remember talking to Peter Van Loan about this.
Do you believe there's anything deliberate about that, Steve?
Well,
do you believe that's a correlation?
I was just about to say, like Peter Van Loan, who was the Stephen Harper cabinet minister, we went back and forth on email about this a while ago, and he said when he was in government, they actually deeply focus group tested the hell out of this to try to better understand this relationship. And at the end of the day, all they were able to conclude was, it happens damn near every time and we don't know why. But there's something in the water of this province that says, we don't want to give one party all the power in Ottawa and in Toronto. And just almost every single time, I mean, there's a couple of exceptions along the way, but almost every single time. And I remember David talking to Greg Sorbera about this in when was it? 2011, when Stephen Harper won his majority government. He thought to himself, okay, this changes the dynamic and opens up the possibility that we Ontario Liberals, who are very unpopular right now under Dalton McGuinty, might have a shot at it. And in fact, they did. They came within one seat of winning their third consecutive majority in the ensuing election.
In this hypothetical scenario, who is the federal Liberal leader, though? Are they as dislikable as Justin Trudeau? Are they seen to be like him? Is it Mark Carney? It really will probably depend on how people are feeling and where they want to take out their frustration.
I think it would be the objective of the party to find somebody who was not as unpopular as Mr. Trudeau.
Oh, I guess
so. This point about the inversion, though, I mean, it's odd because Ontario, in large measure, decides who the federal government is, and so they're often very similar, right? Pierre Trudeau and Bill Davis try to slip a dime between those two governments, right? Even Chrétien and Harris in the 90s were doing largely the same things. You've got a bigger difference between McGuinty and Harper, but by and large, it seems. I assume it's just that when you're in office federally, you consume a lot of oxygen in Ontario and you're generally unpopular. And so it's just the other parties don't have that drag. I've never believed that there's a conscious decision by Ontarians to say, well, if there's this federally, we should have this provincially as a counter.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know that it's a conscious thing, but look at the record. It happens damn near every time.
I know. It's funny. It's like polling. It shouldn't work, but it does. Do the Liberals have a message for Ontario right now, or are they still figuring that out?
I would say they're still figuring that out. Absolutely. I couldn't put a finger on what it is their core point is right now.
And I'd add to that, David, by saying every time the Liberals have the opportunity to distinguish themselves from the NDP and look less left-wing, progressive, and woke than the New Democrats, so far they're fumbling that ball. And I think as an example, I think one opportunity, and I'll say here in the interest of full disclosure, as I always do, my wife is a health policy consultant, but the Conservatives brought in a bill that allowed more publicly insured services to be offered in privately owned healthcare clinics. And the NDP, not surprisingly, opposed that. That is consistent with their ideological position. This might have been an opportunity.
And with the union's interests.
Exactly. And this might have been an opportunity for a new Liberal leader who wanted to make her party more centrist, not to take the identical position the New Democrats took on this issue, and yet they did. Any possibility of taking a more nuanced position, as if to say, we understand healthcare is a tough issue, and it doesn't necessarily need to be ideological. I understand the government's position. I understand the New Democrats' position. Here's our more moderate, pragmatic way of looking at this thing. A Liberal leader who wanted to distinguish herself from the NDP might have given that speech, but she did not. She and her health critic, Adel Shamsi, came out very hot and strong against what the government was doing. So again, as we look for distinctions on the left, I'm still having trouble seeing them.
Yeah, I'm drawn back deep into history, Steve, when I watch Bonnie and her party, thinking back to when Turner took over in 84 from Trudeau and had a bunch of ways, was more centrist than the party he was inheriting and had a bunch of things he wanted to change, but the party wouldn't let him.
Correct, because he'd inherited Pierre Trudeau's party, and where John Turner wanted to be more provincial rights oriented on, for example, minority language rights, his party wouldn't let him. Right. And where he wanted to be sort of more embracing of Quebec's distinctiveness constitutionally and support Meech Lake, his party wouldn't let him. So it's tough. We don't know that Bonnie Crombie's in the same pickle, but it kind of sure looks like she is.
Yeah, I think the party's gotten a bit left, especially as it's gotten weaker. So the Ford PCs seem very well funded. This advertising campaign is any evidence of that. They're certainly not worried about their ability to fund an election campaign, that's for sure. This is not true of the other two parties at all. And media no longer has the capacity to act as a counterweight to advertising. In my view, you could quarrel with that if you want, but that's my view. So this is a big problem for the Liberals and the NDP. And why do you think they're having trouble raising money? Like, why isn't there, there are 60% of Ontarians who think the government should change. Why aren't those people coughing up cash?
That's a pretty good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for it, other than the fact that they haven't figured out a way to talk to normal people, and the avenues for the fundraisers have gone down a lot. They're doing them, but because of if you're not in power, you don't have the ability to have a giant fundraiser. As we film this is the day of Doug Ford's summer kickoff party. It's supposed to be their huge replacement for the leaders' dinner that they canceled this year because of the optics of the Greenbelt scandal. It's $1,000 a ticket event. We expect there'll be a lot of people there. Neither of the other parties can do that. Bonnie Crombie's going around Ontario and having small fundraisers. There's some that are like $1,000 a ticket. That does happen, but they just can't draw in the crowds the way that a party who's in power can do it.
David, you know more about this than I suspect either of us. But if you're in power and you're popular, the opposition parties are always going to have a hard time out fundraising against you. Who wants to give money to potentially alienate a popular government that you need to do business with? So Stiles and Crombie and Schreiner, I guess to a lesser extent, are behind the eight ball even before you begin.
Well, I guess that's true if you're trying to get $2,500 from people. But if you had a robust, actual popular fundraising grassroots fundraising program, that wouldn't be the same factor, I don't think.
The NDP will say that they're breaking their own records, that they're doing more than they have before, that it's all small dollar stuff.
Fuck that. Where's their ad? Show me their goddamn ad on television. Right?
Where are the unions? So this is one thing we didn't talk about yet.
Yeah.
So,
Now, where's working families? Where's working families?
arguing at the Supreme Court.
Don't they support Ford now? Don't they support Ford now?
Well, damn near all of them do.
Right.
That is a big question for me. We're seeing some ads against Bonnie Crombie. Where are the third party ads? If the election is indeed going to be about a year from now is when they're going to want to start advertising. That is what they're fighting for that year ahead of the fixed election date. So will we see them start to pour money into anti-Ford ads? I don't know, but the time would be basically now.
David, you put your finger on a very important development, and that is that the private sector unions, which, they've been overwhelmingly in Doug Ford's camp. Certainly to a small extent in his first election campaign, but in his re-election campaign, enormously. Now, he's never going to get the public sector unions. They hate whoever's in power, regardless of party. But the private sector
especially
unions,
the NDP.
Yeah, you got that right. Yeah. Moral social contract. We remember that. Yeah, but the way that, and I give a former labor minister, Monty McNaughton, a lot of credit on this one. He's gone off to the private sector now, but he's a guy who said to Doug Ford at the beginning, we may have to write off the public sector union vote, but you know what? Our values line up right with private sector unions. And Jesse, how many times have we seen Doug Ford do a photo op where he's got a lot of guys in hard hats behind him? And you know what? I gotta say, they all look very comfortable together.
They seem to be one of these stakeholders with the biggest influence over the government right now as well. It's huge.
Joe Mancinelli from LiUNA in the Laborers International Union. Big time Doug Ford supporter.
Yeah, I recall. But he he and I had a memorable conversation about that on the eve of the call of the 2018 election.
How did it go? I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, for him, it was all about the College of Trades. It was all about the interests of the LiUNA union. And I tried to understand how a labor leader could not support the most pro-labor premier in Ontario history. And he explained that it was really just about the interests of his union. So I said, okay, well, you're a big champion of the working person. So, Joe, keep going. In any event, so that was, I guess, that was I'm over all these things. You want to talk about 2006? Sometimes forgive, never forget. But that business about the unions, I mean, this is something that conservatives writ large have figured out, right? That there's a lot of potential support for them in private sector unions if they stop alienating them. And so you even see the Poilievre people voting for anti-scab legislation, for example, federally, and ensuring that it will be in place after. So that's a big change in the conservative movement.
Well, they saw what worked in the last Ontario election, right? I mean, usually Tories steal seats from Liberals. Last time they stole them from New Democrats. What, right. Jesse, I can't remember, is it 8 or 9 seats that the Tories took from the New Democrats all over Ontario, Southwest, Northeast? I mean, it was really quite a feat.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the current presumed carnage in the federal NDP caucus to Poilievre is pretty significant as well. Mm-hmm. Right? So at the moment, which of these two opposition leaders is performing better? Which of these two people is holding the government to account? I guess that's one measure. And another measure is making some inroads with Ontarians.
Well, let's start with this. It's a bit of an unfair comparison to begin with. I mean, Marit Stiles is in the House. She has a seat. She is the official leader of the official opposition. Is
that an advantage?
Well, I mean, it ought to be. How could it not be? I mean, Bonnie Crombie, frankly, has been spending, a little bit of time at Queen's Park, but she doesn't have a seat. Her party's not officially constituted. They've only got 9 members, not the 12 you need. And frankly, she's bombing all over Ontario as she needs to right now, raising money, raising profile, trying to find candidates, trying to figure out what she stands for in terms of putting a platform together for next spring, if that's required. So, all of the typical metrics that you would use to answer that question certainly line up with Stiles right now.
And Milton was really bad for the Liberals. The whole idea, the value proposition of Bonnie Crombie, why her party chose her, was that she was seen to be the one who could win and who could specifically win in the GTA. And then they didn't. And it wasn't that close. So that's one reason why I'd say maybe Stiles is doing a little bit better right now, but they haven't done well in by-elections either. So maybe it's a toss-up.
Crombie announced her team yesterday.
Yes.
Provincial Chair Tom Allison, campaign directors Jen Tomney and Chad Walsh. Are they organizationally coming together? Is that your sense, Steve? I mean, because we talked about Milton. One of the problems with Milton is there was nobody really in charge of that thing because several of her key people were engaged in the Mississauga mayoralty race.
Yeah. Look, whether they're coming together, we'll only know in the fullness of time. She appointed them yesterday. I'm not sure 24 hours later we can render a verdict on this. All I know is, Tom Allison is a pretty able guy. You know him obviously much better than I do, but the last big thing I remember him running, besides Bonnie Crombie's successful leadership election, was Kathleen Wynne's. And I thought he did a pretty good job on that, given that Kathleen Wynne, I mean, people don't remember this 11 years later, but she was the underdog going into that race. That was Sandra Pupatello's election to win. Yeah. And Tom Allison, I'm sure in combination with many others, figured out a strategy that worked well. They decided they were going to portray Kathleen Wynne as the nice candidate who was going to be able to get that second, third, and fourth ballot support if required. Right. Whereas Sandra Pupatello was sort of going in there with a bit of a scorched earth approach, and that ultimately did not work. So they figured out what would appeal to Liberals and were successful. Now it's 11 years later and it's a different leader and different times. Can he make it rain again? I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, she gave a hell of a convention speech that was really inspiring. I remember being there. And when you talked about what Bonnie Crombie said when she won, kind of reminded me of that. Maybe it's a similar idea, like give the personal, inspiring story to Liberals, to the province, to get people on board.
Yeah, it does seem like there's some generational change, because at the Liberal side, neither Tomney nor Walsh have had this job before. And in the NDP, Balagas is gone. I don't know who's replaced Michael Balagas, so it's going to be really interesting which of these organizations comes together.
Well, let's also keep this in mind, that if the public's looking for a change, then all of what we've just been talking about will be of interest. And if the public isn't looking for a change, none of what we just said will be of interest.
So stick with you, Steve Paikin. If Ford and the PCs lose the next election, why will it have happened?
Aren't you the guy who trains ministers never to answer hypothetical questions?
You're not a minister? And I'm just interested. I'm interested in what you think the subterranean chink in the armor is.
Okay, so if Doug Ford were to lose the next election, whenever it is called, it is, presumably because he has marshaled some kind of self-inflicted wound that the public just did not anticipate, and therefore required a very deep second look at him, because the bridge of trust that he has between himself and a big enough chunk of the electorate to get reelected has somehow broken down. So what could that be? Well, Jesse referred to it earlier. It could be charges related to the Greenbelt, although there is an argument that, with his volte-face on that and the firing of the minister and so on, that cake is somewhat baked right now. But RCMP charges against a sitting government, particularly if it were to go deep into either the premier's office or a senior ministerial person or staffer, presumably that would cause people to perk up a little bit and say, that's not good. If there's any other malfeasance that comes to the fore, I mean, certainly that's a possibility. But as you look at the list of potential stumbling blocks at the moment, it's not abundantly clear, which may explain why the polls have been so static lately.
Good. You ever thought about this, Jessica? What is the thing that's lurking there that's not really impacting right now, but could turn an election?
I'm not sure it's able to turn an election, but the LCBO, alcohol sales liberalization, I think is not as popular as the government seems to think it is. Our polling, at least that we commissioned, suggested it wasn't, and that if it does cost the public purse quite a lot, it becomes very, very unpopular. So a lot depends on if, what we'll see as that plays out, and if it's seeable before voters go to the poll. But decisions like that, where people feel like you're selling off a public asset, they don't like it all the time. And that one might actually come out to hurt rather than help.
Couple other things, David, if I can add quickly. Number one, I don't recall a premier who, and I don't say this as a criticism, I just say it as a fact, he has a desperate need to be personally loved. That is a major organizing principle around everything he does in his government. He'd like to be respected, but more than that, he really feels a need to be deeply liked, if not loved, by the electorate. And therefore, that may animate a lot of what goes on over the next little while. The other thing is
getting booed at that Raptors thing.
Yes,
helped make him make a pivot in his government, right?
Absolutely true. You're referring to the 2019 World Championship Raptors parade, where John Tory was introduced and got applauded. Justin Trudeau was introduced on stage and got applauded, and Doug Ford, like barely a year into his government, got introduced and got booed by a big chunk of that crowd, and that really affected the way he does things. And the other thing is, and this is the reason why we all love watching politics, it's so interesting, is that there's so much up in the air right now, right? We don't know the timing of the next federal election. We don't even know who the leaders of the parties are going to be. But if you can imagine, and again, we don't know, but if you can imagine 200 conservative seats in Ottawa, and then potentially Pierre Poilievre making some very difficult decisions and becoming a little less popular, and then, if it works out this way, Doug Ford going to the polls after that, you can imagine that would have an adverse impact on the Ontario PC Party fortunes. And remember, they don't have to beat Doug Ford. They just have to hold him to a minority, because there are certain circumstances whereby, and we saw this in 1985, where if the NDP or the Liberals can come second and get the support of the other progressive party, you can kick the Tories out and govern. It's happened before in our lifetimes. Well, at least, David, in yours and my lifetime. I'm not sure about that. Were you alive in 1985?
Yeah, barely.
So let's end on that note. Jessica, what's your guess on the election timing in Ontario?
Next spring, just 1 year early.
Okay. Spring of 2025.
Yeah.
Right. And Steve?
I'll give you a twofer. I'll say yes, spring 2025. And I'll go further to say federally, if Justin Trudeau hangs around, December of 2026.
Right.
Take the whole 5 years.
Well, that's the history of it. Listen, thank you. This was so much fun. My God, a lot of insight and a barrel of laughs. It was great.
And not one insult about how your Rough Riders beat my Ticats last week. Thank you.
No. Listen, that was a tie game. And fucking Bo Levi Mitchell, I thought he was washed up. So now I'm bummed about the fact that he can still throw the ball. Although I bet he can't throw it deep. I don't think he can throw it deep. All right.
Thanks, David.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Sorry about the football talk. All right, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN, all you Herle Burlyites who watched or listened to this show, and to those people who responded to my plea about the people who hate the curse of politics on YouTube and told me that you like the curse of politics on YouTube. Thanks. Warmed my heart. Take care. See you next week.